Hi, everyone. I'm Francis James, Industry Relations Director at Beneficial State Foundation and host of our quarterly DEI Fireside Chat series. And we are so honored to have Professor Khalil Gibran Muhammad join us as our special guest. Professor Muhammad is the Ford Foundation Professor of History, Race, and Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. He's a leading scholar on the history of race and inequality in America, and he directs the institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project at Harvard. Prior to his current role, Professor Muhammad served as the director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, a division of the New York Public Library and the world's leading repository of global Black history and culture. His work critically examines the intersections of race, democracy, and economic justice, making him a powerful voice in the conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion. A native of Chicago's South Side, Professor Muhammad graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with a BA in economics and earned his Ph.D. in U.S. history from Rutgers. Professor Muhammad, welcome.
Thank you so much, Francis, for having me. It's a joy to be here.
Great. So I would like to start off this conversation by congratulating you on your appointment to Princeton University effective January of 2025, where you will serve in its African American Studies Department and in the School of Public and International Affairs. So what were the circumstances that made you decide to accept an appointment to Princeton?
Well, I think that there's a larger, well, let me say there's a small answer, which is that I live in New Jersey, and I've been commuting to Cambridge, Massachusetts by plane more or less for almost 9 years. And so there's something very attractive about just driving to work. But I will say that there's a larger problem with our elite universities, of which Harvard is perhaps the crisis point in the broader system of higher education. And that is that universities have become ground zero for a political attack on truth in education. And the cultural wedge that is being used to advance this political attack is the teaching of race and racism, of gender and sexuality, and various higher ed commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I will just say, in my case, I was a prominent target for Republicans, particularly the committee that investigated Claudine Gay, Liz McGill of Penn, and Sally Kornbluth of MIT. In the opening remarks of Congresswoman Virginia Foxx, Republican from North Carolina, she identified my class as being directly responsible for anti-Semitism on campus. And to be frank, that was in December. To this day, the university leadership has never once defended the fact that my class is not responsible for anti-Semitism on campus. And nor has the university defended a number of other faculty who teach material like I teach in the classroom, or the numerous staff who are charged with the responsibility of executing Harvard's DEI commitments. And so when Princeton came calling to recruit me back in the fall, which was before October 7th, but the process of recruitment takes place over many, many months, it was easy to say yes.
Yeah, I fully understand. So one of the courses that you teach at Harvard is titled Race and Racism in the Making of the United States as a Global Power. This course draws from research from the social sciences to highlight the institutions of racial domination that have helped to produce durable racial hierarchies with specific attention to the modes through which hierarchies have been created and maintained. So when you teach this course, what are some of the key themes and narratives that surprise your students?
Oh, wow. Well, first of all, my students are surprised at how little American history they actually know. Only about half of my students are US-born students. Many of them are international students. And of those international students, they come from all over the world. But there's a large concentration of students from East Asia and South Asia. And then I have a number of students from Europe and Africa and Latin America. So I don't expect the international students to have as great a command of American history, but many of them do have a sense that they sort of know the big story. And the degree to which the systems of racism that we know, from slavery to segregation to deportation law, sort of founded in the context of Chinese Americans, to Japanese internment, to the ways in which people like Bhagat Singh could not gain citizenship because he was not considered white, even though the Supreme Court said Caucasians are white people. Anyway, there's so much history that turns on how my students understand contemporary policy questions. I will also say that we spend a lot of time unpacking the origins of the model minority myth, which for many of these students is a very important aspect of their own socialization. For those who are first generation Americans, they've grown up in immigrant households, and they have been told that this country is a wonderful place of opportunity. If you work hard, you can succeed. And those other people of color who are not succeeding, it is because of their own fault or cultural behavior. And so there's a lot of unpacking that takes place for many of those students. And then the last thing I'll say is that we do spend a lot of time understanding the contemporary context of economic inequality and systemic racism in financial markets and housing markets that contribute to what many people now describe as the racial wealth gap.
Right. Very good. So this leads very nicely to the kind of the next question. So can the historical context of race and economic inequality in this country inform, the financial services industry approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Oh, no, there's no question about it. And again, the proof for me is nearly a decade of teaching this material to adult students. Let me just remind the audience that many of my students, the largest percentage of my students, and I teach 120 this semester, I've taught that number or greater over the past 5 years in this particular class, the one you described, Race, Racism, and the Making of the U.S. as a Global Power. The largest percentage of my students come from consulting. And while consulting isn't necessarily financial services proper, oftentimes those two fields overlap. So in this instance, what most of my students will tell you, having taken the course, is that hanging over consulting and financial services is an underlying belief that the inequalities that everyone is aware of are a product of financial illiteracy, or a lack of skills in the marketplace where consumers of financial products are simply not making the smartest choices. This was certainly the governing explanation for the Great Recession and the crash in the housing market, with various real estate derivatives being marketed that had very poor financials underneath. The point is that what they learn is that some prime predatory lending has been going on since Black people had access to capital in financial services, that the penalty for people whose redline divested communities are used as a proxy for their higher credit risk are baked in regardless of individual circumstance. If you call a mortgage lender, for example, and you give them basic information, including where you live, without stronger regulatory work and more enforceable anti-discrimination law, my students learn that those people are more likely, not in all instances, to be subjected to unfair lending practices. So it's the range of both historical understandings that these systems grow out of deliberate and intentional ways of exploiting and oppressing people, to contemporary manifestations where, without much effort, even good people can participate in these systems that will produce these inequalities.
Thank you for that insight into that particular question. So the U.S. Census Bureau projects that the United States will become a majority minority country by roughly 2045. So how can a diverse and inclusive workforce improve a bank's ability to serve a more racially, ethnically, and culturally diverse customer base?
Well, again, to the extent that banking has a poor track record particularly in low-income communities of color, where you have the greatest number of potential customers as depositors and potential borrowers. You also have the longest history of mistrust. And the degree to which the bank's commitment to a robust DEI philosophy and program would help to mitigate against that mistrust is one way we could see a shift in the relationship that would redound, presumably, to the benefit of both banks as well as depositors. But there's a bigger problem, and that is that even if there are more bank tellers at the retail side, more lenders in terms of home financing and other credit lending products for banks, and of course for wealth management for individuals who are looking to invest long-term for retirement and other financial services, just having a Black or brown or even Asian American service provider won't necessarily guarantee that an individual is getting the best service. Wells Fargo, for example, is a bank that certainly had a population of people of color who were very much part of a system of rank racism and discrimination against people of color. So we still need more robust regulation and compliance with existing anti-discrimination law in order to ensure that banks are actually following the law. We may actually need new legislation. For example, in New Jersey, a recent housing law penalizes landlords, for example, who use an arrest record in a credit report as a reason not to lend to people. The state legislature passed a law that essentially said you cannot discriminate against a person who has a prior criminal record. But they're still doing it. And so the Attorney General has to actually do his job in this case in enforcing that law. So there's a big gap between what banks do as individual agencies within a larger system, policing the behavior of their own employees, at the same time that the regulatory dimensions of the federal government and state agencies have to do their job to ensure that banks and other financial services are following the law.
Right. So your comments lead very nicely to kind of my next question, and it would be, so what are the potential risks for banks that fail to address issues of racial and economic inequity within their operations and customer service departments?
I would have said, Francis, I'll be honest with you, even just in the last 2 or 3 years, I would have said that they would lose market share. But I'm a little bit unsure at this point, because here's what we know. We know that according to lots of research, but for people listening, they can certainly read the work of Mesro Baradaran, who's written a fabulous book called The Color of Money. Or you can look at a Citigroup report that came out in 2020. But what these reports and studies tell us is that a lot of low-income communities of color are underbanked, that they are banking deserts, and the absence of a competitive market in these communities means that people are subjected, on one hand, to banks that are undercapitalized. They may be CDFIs and historical banks that work in those communities. On the other hand, they may be subject to predatory lending agencies like payday loan centers. And to some degree, even when they might have a major retail bank in their communities, like a Chase or otherwise, they are often subjected to usurious fees because they don't meet a certain minimum threshold in terms of how much they are have on deposit with a particular bank. So the problem for how we solve this problem also has to do with the larger problem of economic inequality in this country. And the degree to which the financial services sector is still focused on shareholders as the primary basis of how it determines risk and profit means that unless we change a little bit of the philosophy of what banking means for a healthy economy, I'm not sure that banks will take on greater exposure to working with these customers without some other incentive. Now, on the good side, we are beginning to see banks such as yours simply commit and simply accept that the cost of doing good business that is community focused also means not maximizing profit in terms of shareholder returns. Some people have criticized me publicly, including Christopher Rufo, one of the Manhattan Institute fellows and architects of the anti-CRT, anti-DEI crusade, for basically calling that anti-capitalism and socialism. You can call it what you want, but the destructive way in which some banks are not interested in serving certain communities means that there are inefficiencies in the movement of capital within communities that could contribute overall to GDP and growth in this economy. And so it's a good thing that certain banks, particularly fintechs, banks that have almost no infrastructure in terms of physical presence in communities, are beginning to see that they can make a good return and also do good in terms of the customers that they serve.
Thank you for those insights. Can banks measure the success of their DEI initiatives and programs beyond just recruiting, retaining, and promoting diverse talent?
Absolutely. So one way that this is already happening, you and I talked a little bit about some place-based work. I mentioned that Robert Smith, one of the large private equity investors in fintechs, has been supporting an initiative called the Southern Communities Initiative, which I believe looks at 3 states in the South. At least 2 of them are Louisiana and Texas. They were also working with PayPal, another financial services agency. And the basic idea here is that the measurement of success is not simply who's involved in this work, from community organizations that are helping to shape and define what kinds of investment moves into community needs and services, such as grocery stores and small businesses, but also understanding that you can actually measure the amount of capital flows into a community. So one way in which Robert Smith is interested in this question is the degree to which we understand who lives in a particular community, how much capital is moving into that community, and ultimately the number of deposits held by individuals in those communities. Some of this, in terms of regulation, was addressed with the Community Reinvestment Act almost 40 years ago, where the federal government essentially said, if you take deposits in a community, you have a minimal obligation to make loans in that community. But we know that there's been a lot of poor compliance with Community Reinvestment Act, in part because the demographics of who lives in communities is shifting in part. And so the people who are most in need are often neglected for other more upwardly mobile, often white residents of some of these same communities. But the point is that you can actually measure how much investment capital is moving into a community with a place-based scale. And that is probably at this point the gold standard for whether or not banks are making genuine investments in communities. I'll cite one other company that is called Lafayette Square. Lafayette Square essentially lends, it is a fundraiser for the investments that organizations, whether small businesses or other companies, need essentially as an investment banker. But what they are doing is they are lending at a slight discount and investing in companies at a slight discount based on a commitment to a certain number of HR standards and what would generally be described as community benefit agreements in certain kinds of public-private collaborations. In this case, it's a private company. They're not using community benefits agreements, but they're holding the borrower or the investor accountable for meeting minimum standards in terms of employment. So the percentage of people who will be employed who come from that community for whatever the new business is that they're investing in. So whether it's a Whole Foods or a Trader Joe's or some other grocery store that is pursuing capital from Lafayette Square, they will agree to receive that capital at a slightly lower discount in exchange for meeting what they call a kind of equity set of goals in order to have this relationship. And that, to me, is a wonderful model for how banks can measure the impact that they're making in communities rather than simply looking at the return on investment.
Yeah, love those examples. What are some effective strategies that banks can implement to promote institutional anti-racism and accountability within their organizations?
Well, the first thing is that our research at the IRA Project has examined a body of work that we aggregate and translate for large audiences. We lift the veil of academic subscriber-based journal research and make it available through an open source. We call this the Race Research and Policy Portal. And we look across various industries from higher education to healthcare to private sector, which can be inclusive of banks. I also want to point people to, and I'm sure, Francis, you've already talked to Michael McAfee at his work at PolicyLink and organizations like that. So a lot of us are invested in what are the steps and appropriate interventions for financial services institutions to do the kind of DEI and anti-racist work at scale and that is sustainable. And here are a few things that we've learned. We've learned that without leadership committed to this work does not happen. It is performative and it is ineffective. Additionally, leadership has to have the people responsible for executing a DEI report directly to leadership. It cannot roll up into HR because that's all it will be. It will simply be who do we hire, who do we promote, and how do we keep track of churn when it comes to various individuals. The third is that performance measures have to be attached to various DEI goals, including personnel and how we track pay equity and various goals within the organization and promotional goals. That performance measure and performance tracking is also tied to data transparency. So one of the great problems in this field is the unwillingness of management either to collect appropriate data to ensure that they are achieving outcomes as clearly tied to operational and business goals, or another problem, which is not always studied in the data, because much of what happens in the private sector is not subject to audit or scrutiny, certainly by researchers who are not invited in to look in the books. But what we find is that senior management will not share the data with various managers in organizations. So they may collect it, but they don't share it. So first, leadership. Second, the right reporting structure. Third, performance measures to hold people accountable for the work that they are achieving. And fourth, making sure that there's sufficient data to make sure that the work is getting done. Why is this so simple? It's so simple because corporations understand how to be successful at the things that are priorities. If the things that are priorities don't have a proper management structure, if they don't have proper accountability structure, and you don't have the data to measure whether you're succeeding or failing, guess what? It doesn't happen. And so one of the ways that banks can also establish DEI commitments that are more robust than, say, what might look like mostly a personnel matter is to ensure that the bank's B2B relationships are also based on a commitment to equity. Is the bank, if it's a large bank, is it making deposits with smaller banks? Is it moving some of its money into smaller banks? Is it helping to underwrite loans for a smaller bank that may be able to close deals, but may need a partner in order to close those deals, which would, of course, increase the capitalization of smaller banks and allow them to have more leverage and diversification in their portfolio if they only have small loans, which may have a higher risk portfolio, but a bigger loan with less risk, but simply wouldn't be able to meet the borrower's needs without having a partner on the back end. These are the kinds of things that, again, I'm a historian, I'm not a banker, but it's obvious that if banks want to play in this space and do it well and be part of a solution that a lot of banks have benefited from the problem, then there's a lot of low-hanging fruit for banks to be good at this. I will lastly note that for years, banks have reported on their CSRs, their corporate social responsibility reports, what amounts to basically philanthropy and marketing, which is to say they buy tickets at various nonprofit organizations. They may be title sponsor. So, some of these amounts are not insignificant, could be $100,000 or whatever, if it's in the New York area. But across the country, this pattern has been an insufficient mechanism and has been a tertiary side of the business, which has not really moved the needle. Is that charity important to the various organizations that are on the receiving end? Absolutely. Does that charity change the way the system works? Absolutely not. And so that kind of philanthropy and marketing, meaning here's the great work that we do, we put our name all over things in exchange for supporting a nonprofit, is an old model that needs to be abandoned, at least to the extent that it gets in the way of doing the harder work, which is how do we make our money in a way that is responsible to the people who we say are valuable to us as our customer base.
Yeah, thank you for those really invaluable perspectives, insights here. So, the financial services industry broadly has been responsible for, lots of creation of inequities in our society. And so I would ask you, how does our deeper understanding of the historical roles in banks in creating and perpetuating economic disparities kind of truly inform and even shape how we might think about DEI within our institutions?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a one that I think circles back to something I said earlier. So let's just start with the current reality. For decades, most Americans, when asked in survey research, and there are a couple of general community survey, American community surveys. These are surveys that Pew Research either builds upon or borrows, or Gallup. I'm just mentioning it so people understand they can look these things up. They don't have to simply take my word for it. When you ask most Americans, and this data is consistent over decades, how to explain the inequality and disparity that exists between whites and blacks or between whites and Hispanics, most Americans, including blacks and Hispanics, will say that the problem are the individual choices that people make and not discrimination. That's changed a little bit in light of Donald Trump's election in 2016. There is greater sensitivity to discrimination as a causative force in those inequalities. But by and large, most Americans have been socialized to believe that these massive disparities are mostly a function of, again, as I mentioned earlier, what we would call financial illiteracy. People who are making bad long-term decisions for their own financial well-being, and it is not the financial service sector's fault. Now, it doesn't take much for most people on this call to realize that there are a lot of banks that will presumptively take advantage of people who don't know better. In other words, both things can be true. You can have a low information customer who could be informed by a bank that there are better products for you and worse products for you. Or the bank could say, well, hey, have I got a deal for you? So what we know across the board, here's what we know for a fact. We know through extensive experimental research studies, as well as extensive audit tests, which are often led by the government, that there is, and I want to be crystal clear, extensive discrimination in financial services. It takes place at all levels, including basic algorithm injustice that simply prices access to capital higher based on nothing more than where a person lives, which is not about individual ambition and literacy. It's about where you happen to live, which in a segregated country is a direct relationship to the history that most Americans were not taught in school. Additionally, the story of subprime lending in Black communities is a rich case study of the way in which banks deliberately built a business model that would be extractive and exploitative to poor people. Not because poor people didn't know they were getting a bad deal, but in some cases because they had no other options. And so, in a monopolistic environment where a small number of banks have a captive customer base, people don't have a whole lot of options. And this is partly and probably even mostly a consequence of housing segregation, where people are much more likely to bank based on what's available to them in their communities. Obviously, fintechs are changing that relationship where there is no bank in the neighborhood and you can get a better deal because that's the philosophy of the company. I say all this to say, Francis, that the history of financial services going back to the Freedmen's Bank, which was established by Abraham Lincoln with a charter of the federal government. I don't know if your audience has heard this story before, but it's just a perfect expression of so much of what we're dealing with today. The Freedmen's Bank was an opportunity for the formerly enslaved 4 million Black people in the late 1860s to have access to financial services, to be able to not only deposit their hard-earned wages as a largely overwhelming agricultural labor force, but to be able to borrow from the Freedmen's Bank so that they could buy land for the first time, so that they could literally achieve their own American dream in the aftermath of 250 years of slavery. What happened to the Freedmen's Bank? The people who were responsible for the Freedmen's Bank were land and railroad speculators who took the deposits of those hard-earned dollars of Black people and squandered the money in land and railroad speculation and lost it all. Just as the bank was about to go under, Frederick Douglass, yes, the famous abolitionist, was brought in basically to try to save the bank. But the problem wasn't that it was Frederick Douglass, the former abolitionist who had the financial skills to do this. The problem was the money was gone. There was no turning this situation around. So the bank soon closed. And famous Black leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois, and I'm going to paraphrase here, essentially said in the aftermath of this debacle, basically said that Black people would never trust banks again. And while he certainly was correct in that the level of mistrust that came in the wake of this did limit the ability of Black people to support banks, it certainly didn't last forever. And a number of insurance companies and Black banks did eventually grow out of the ashes of that terrible history. But that's a kind of history that I think people need to know, because they need to understand that at some basic level, a lot of people have been the kind of financial raw material for their own economic wealth and accumulation.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing up the Freedman example. So just the recollection of that story brings back, financial trauma for many families in America, but we need to continue to highlight those stories to show that, we have probably a moral obligation to try to rectify the wrongs of history. So what advice would you give to banking professionals who want to be more active in promoting a DEI culture within their respective organizations?
Well, first, just in keeping with what we've been talking about, educate yourself about what's happened in financial services. I came out of school as an econ major. I tried to get a job at Goldman Sachs. I ended up landing my first job at Deloitte and Touche when it was Deloitte and Touche. I was on the accounting side, not the consulting side. I mention this because I'm a product of the 1980s, which I imagine, Francis, you might be too, and many others on this call. And for many of us, the idea of making money in banking or in the financial sector was what our parents expected of us. It was a measure and sign of success. And nowhere in that career trajectory and this kind of wisdom about how to be successful in America for my generation of Gen Xers, and many of, I'd say even most of my colleagues either went into financial services, and I mean peers coming out of college. I went to the University of Pennsylvania, Donald Trump's alma mater at Wharton, by the way. For many of us, there was never any cautionary note that the basic business structure that you were buying into would have this dark side to it, where you would be expected to participate in deals that either ignored the needs of the capital needs of a vast majority of Americans, or that when those needs were to be met, that it would be usurious or be unfair terms or would be predatory, which again, I hope that people don't take offense at this, because the evidence is unmistakable what happened in the Great Recession. And I'm not sure that we are too much further down the path from that, other than the fact that there are much greater regulations on what happened in that moment. So people today need to commit themselves to understanding how these systems have worked. And this doesn't implicate every bank in a nefarious set of business practices, but it does suggest that the basic underwriting processes of many banks are not set up to serve the needs in an, dare I say, equitable way. I mean, everybody knows on this call that the presumption that low-income people have to pay more for access to everything is a actuarial choice and decision based on risk, is the excuse. You know, I didn't make up the rules, the market made up the rules. But it is also not true that everybody who is well-to-do should get all the great deals that they get. I mean, it's not an accident that in pursuit of wealthy clients, that most banks waive almost all fees. They don't have to do that because those wealthy clients could in fact pay those fees. They do it because they think they're competing for a small group of people, and those small group of people hold the cards as to who's going to give them the best deal. It's the same race to the competitive bottom as Texas insisting that it have the lowest possible regulations for businesses, no taxes, no regulations. Texas is open for business, as compared to a state like New Jersey, where I live, where there is greater sensitivity to the environment. There is greater sensitivity to corporate responsibility and paying taxes so that the roads get built and the bridges don't fall and the tunnels work. But as long as Texas exists, any individual business will say, hey, I'm moving to Texas as opposed to New Jersey. So we need a broader regulatory environment that doesn't penalize individual do-gooders, individual banks or individual people who are leading those banks, who want to do good, but know that the marketplace is going to punish that behavior. Obviously, Elizabeth Warren had some sensitivities to this in establishing the Consumer Financial Bureau as part of our cabinet structure, establishing a wealth tax. But there are other people thinking about how to create a system that moves capital in ways that is fairer to the people who have long been excluded from having reasonable and fair access to it. And I think, to answer your question, people on this call, obviously a beneficial bank, believe in this. A lot of other banks can begin this journey and ask themselves, you know, can we actually do better and hold ourselves accountable to a new standard that we won't essentially say it's those people's fault that they don't have the long-term savings and investments for economic security because they made bad choices.
Fantastic. So this will be the last question of the formal Q&A session before we invite our colleagues to weigh into the conversation. So the final question for you, Professor Muhammad, is, from your vantage point, what are some of the common challenges or resistance factors you've observed when institutions attempt to implement DEI initiatives, and how can they potentially be overcome?
Whoa, this is a good one. So essentially, at all levels of management, you can have resistance that essentially mitigates against change. So it can come from anywhere, but in obvious ways, you can have a board that is not committed, but a CEO who is. You can have a board that is committed and a CEO that is uncommitted and is not necessarily reporting to the board all that is happening underneath and is setting up their people for failure. You can have a well-meaning CEO who doesn't believe that the organization should change its reporting structures and establish new performance benchmarks, which is another way in which good intentions don't lead to good behavior. You can have a wonderful CDO, a chief diversity officer of an organization, who is reporting to an HR lead who doesn't actually believe in the work and is sabotaging it by not creating transparency in terms of data metrics. You get the point that the largest bottlenecks to change in organizations tend to be a failure of commitment somewhere in the reporting structure in terms of making sure that this work happens at scale. The last example that I did not mention is obviously shareholders. When BlackRock was committed to promoting new ESG standards and began to promote racial equity standards for whether or not it would make huge bets on certain businesses, since they have so many assets under management, their ability to require such led to a backlash by a number of activist shareholders who said that this was inappropriate for BlackRock to be doing, which put enough pressure on Larry Fink to back off. So somewhere in the larger ecosystem that governs the ability of individual banks and the system as a whole to be effective in this work, we still have a pernicious belief that the fundamentals of the system are not racist, that banks are not predatory, that the markets are optimizing the pricing of access to capital appropriately at all levels of society. And as Michael McAfee has probably said to this community, or others are aware of, don't actually believe the economic analysis that were banks to be committed to racial equity in their practices, that the economy would grow by something like $1.6 trillion annually. Because the extent to which banks play a role in investment capital, and investment capital contributes to business growth, and business growth and contributes to greater employment and increases consumer spending, you name it. That is what McAfee and others are saying. They are learning from a lot of CEOs that they really just don't believe it's true.
And on behalf of Beneficial State Foundation and Bank, we want to extend our profound and deep gratitude to you, Professor Muhammad, for this really powerful, insightful discourse in terms of just, the sort of just our thinking about race and racism, and your perspectives on how we, as financial services providers and systems change organizations, how we can think more broadly about advancing and elevating this work. So thank you so much for your time. We look forward to future conversations.
Thank you so much, Francis, for having me. And I've said hello in the chat, but I really appreciate everyone being so attentive and the great questions from Darnell and Richard. Thank you all for having me. And I'm rooting for you. So we'll be in touch, Francis. You let me know when you have really good news to share. I'll be sure to amplify it.
Very good. Take care.